The rain came down in relentless sheets, a cold, unyielding curtain that blurred the edges of the world. Clara stood at the edge of the cemetery, her black dress clinging to her skin, heavy with water and grief. In her arms, she held her 6-month-old daughter, Lily, bundled tightly against her chest, the baby's soft warmth the only anchor keeping Clara from dissolving into the storm. The wooden coffin before her, plain and unadorned, rested on ropes above the open grave, waiting to be lowered into the earth. It held James, her husband of 3 years, taken by a fever that had swept through him in 3 merciless days. The preacher's voice droned on, his words about eternal rest and God's will swallowed by the roar of the rain. Clara barely heard him. Her eyes were fixed on the coffin, on the reality that James was gone, and with him, the life they dreamed of in this unforgiving Montana valley. Around her, a sparse gathering of townsfolk stood under black umbrellas, their faces a mix of pity and discomfort. They were neighbors, acquaintances from church, a few merchants who'd known James from his trips to town. None approached her. They whispered among themselves, their voices low, their eyes darting to Clara and then away, as if her loss was contagious. She was 23, a widow with a baby, and the weight of their judgment pressed against her as heavily as the rain. She could almost hear their thoughts. Poor thing, left with that failing farm. What'll she do now? But no one offered more than a murmured condolence, a quick nod before they turned back to their own lives. Clara didn't blame them. Not really. This was a hard land, and people had their own burdens to carry. Still, the isolation cut deeper than she'd expected. Lily stirred, letting out a soft whimper, her tiny face scrunching against the damp fabric of Clara's dress. "Shh, sweet girl," Clara whispered, rocking her gently. "We'll be all right." The words tasted like a lie. She wasn't sure she believed them, wasn't sure how she'd face the days ahead without James. He'd been her partner in everything, clearing the rocky fields, planting the first crops, building the small farmhouse that was now her only refuge. They'd laughed together, planned together, dreamed of a future where Lily would grow up running through green pastures, safe and loved. Now, that future was buried under 6 feet of mud, and Clara felt like she was sinking with it. A shadow moved beside her, and Clara flinched, startled. She hadn't heard anyone approach, but there he was, a man in a worn Stetson, his long duster coat slick with rain. He held a black umbrella, tilting it to shield her and Lily from the downpour. His face was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of years under the sun, and his eyes, a pale green like sagebrush after a storm, were steady and unreadable. Clara recognized him vaguely, Tom Rourke, a drifter who passed through town now and then, working odd jobs before moving on. Folks called him a cowboy, though he owned no cattle, no land, just a horse, a saddle, and a quiet way that made people uneasy. He wasn't one for small talk, and the townsfolk didn't trust men who didn't put down roots. "You don't have to stand here alone," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel underfoot. He didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the grave, holding the umbrella steady over her and Lily. Clara stiffened, her pride rearing up like a cornered animal. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled, betraying her. She wasn't fine. She was terrified, exhausted, and drowning in a sorrow so vast that threatened to swallow her whole. But she didn't know this man, didn't trust the kindness of strangers. Not after the whispers, the averted eyes, the way people had already begun to treat her like a ghost of the woman she'd been. Tom didn't argue, didn't leave. He just stood there, the umbrella a small circle of shelter and the storm, rain dripping off the brim of his hat. The mourners began to drift away, their umbrellas bobbing like dark flowers as they hurried to their wagons. The preacher closed his Bible, gave Clara a solemn nod, and muttered something about God's plan before retreating to his own shelter. The gravediggers, 2 men with weathered faces and calloused hands, began their work, their shovels biting into the pile of dirt beside the grave. Soon, it was just Clara, Lily, and the cowboy, the rain hammering the earth like a heartbeat. "Why are you here?" Clara asked finally, her voice sharper than she'd intended. Lily stirred again, and she softened her tone, rocking the baby gently. "You didn't know James." Tom shifted his weight, the umbrella unwavering. "Didn't need to," he said simply. "Saw you standing here. Looked like you could use someone to keep the rain off." Clara blinked, caught off guard. It was such a small gesture, holding an umbrella, but in that moment, it felt like Moria, like he was holding back the storm itself. She wanted to snap at him, to tell him she didn't need his help, but the words stuck in her throat. Her arms ached from holding Lily, her legs trembled from standing so long, and her heart felt like it might shatter under the weight of her loss. She wasn't sure she could keep standing, not without something to lean on. They stood in silence as the gravediggers worked, the dull thud of dirt on wood echoing in Clara's chest. Each shovelful felt like another piece of James slipping away, another piece of her life buried. She wanted to scream, to beg them to stop, to give her just one more moment with him. But she stood still, clutching Lily, her tears mixing with the rain on her face. Tom didn't speak, didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just held the umbrella, his presence steady and unyielding, like a rock in a river. When the grave was filled, the earth packed down into a smooth, dark mound, the gravediggers tipped their hats to Clara and shuffled off, their boots squelching in the mud. She stared at the grave, her mind replaying the last days of James's life. He had the fever that burned through him, his weak smile as he promised he'd be fine, the way his hand had gone limp in hers. He wasn't supposed to die, she whispered, more to herself than to Tom. He promised we'd make it together. Tom was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the grave. When he spoke, his voice was soft but steady. Sometimes promises get broken, not cause anyone wants to. Life's just a broken bar, mean like that. Clara turned to look at him, expecting platitudes or pity, but his face was honest, etched with lines that spoke of his own losses. She wondered what they were. What had carved those lines into a man who couldn't be much older than 30? A wife, a family, a home he'd left behind? She didn't ask, not yet. Her own grief was too raw, too all-consuming, to make room for curiosity. You got a place to go? Tom asked, nodding at Lily, who had fallen asleep against Clara's chest, her tiny breaths warm against her mother's neck. The farm, Clara said, the word heavy with dread. What's left of it? The farm was a small patch of land they'd bought with every penny they had, a dream they'd poured their hearts into. But the soil was rocky, the winters brutal, and the debts had piled up faster than the crops. James had been optimistic, always talking about next year, about how they'd turn it around. Now, it was just Clara, Lily, and a crumbling barn that leaked in every storm. Tom nodded, as if that was enough. I'll walk you. She wanted to refuse, to tell him she could manage, but her body betrayed her. Her legs were leaden, her arms trembling from holding Lily so long. So she let him walk beside her, holding the umbrella over her and the baby as they trudged through the mud to the wagon. The townsfolk had gone, their wagons already disappearing down the road, leaving ruts in the wet earth. Tom tied his horse to the back of the wagon, a lean bay mare that snorted softly, and climbed onto the driver's seat. He took the reins without a word, guiding the old mare through the rain-soaked road toward the farm. Clara sat beside him, Lily cradled in her lap, and stared out at the blurred landscape. The valley stretched around them, its hills cloaked in mist, the distant mountains looming like silent sentinels. She'd once thought this place beautiful, full of promise. Now, it felt like a trap, a land that took more than it gave. She glanced at Tom, his profile sharp against the gray sky, and wondered why he was doing this. Men like him didn't stay. They drifted, chasing whatever called them to the next horizon. Yet here he was, driving her wagon, shielding her from the rain. The farmhouse came into view, a squat, weathered structure with the sagging porch and the chimney that hadn't been lit in days. The barn stood a short distance away, its roof patched with mismatched boards. Tom pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, offering a hand to help Clara. She hesitated, then took it, his grip firm but careful, like he knew she was a breath from breaking. He carried the umbrella as they walked to the porch, shielding Lily, who stirred but didn't wake. Inside, the house was cold and dim, the air heavy with the smell of damp wood and unwashed dishes. Clara laid Lily in her crib, a simple wooden cradle James had built with his own hands. The baby's tiny chest rose and fell, her face peaceful in sleep, and Clara felt a pang of love so fierce it nearly undid her. She brushed a finger over Lily's cheek, then turned to find Tom standing by the door, his hat in his hands, looking out of place in the small, cluttered room. I'll check the barn, he said, his voice breaking the silence. "Make sure the roof's holding." "You don't have to," Clara started, but he was already moving, the door clicking shut behind him. She sank into a chair by the cold hearth, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. The silence of the house was deafening without James, his laughter, his quiet humming as he worked, the way he'd call her name from the fields. She didn't know how she'd keep going, how she'd raise Lily alone, how she'd face the bank when they came for the land. The debts were overdue, the crops too sparse to cover them, and the thought of losing the farm, the last piece of James, was more than she could bear. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in the fog of her thoughts, before the door opened again. Tom stepped inside, his boots muddy, his duster dripping onto the floor. "Barn sound," he said, wiping his hands on his coat. "Got a few leaks, but I can patch AM tomorrow if you want." "Tomorrow?" Clara asked, frowning. She stood, brushing her hands on her skirt, trying to summon the strength to send him away. "You don't live here, Mr. Rourke. You don't owe me anything." He shrugged, setting his hat on the table. "Figured I'd stick around a bit if you need an extra hand." Clara studied him, searching for the catch. Men didn't offer help without wanting something, land, money, or something else. But Tom's face was open, his eyes steady, and she saw no hint of ulterior motive, just a quiet resolve, like he'd made up his mind and wouldn't be swayed. She didn't trust it, not fully, but she was too tired to argue. "All right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow." He nodded, stepping back toward the door. "I'll bed down in the barn." "Got my bedroll." "You need anything, just holler." She watched him go, his silhouette fading into the rain, now a soft drizzle as the storm began to ease. The umbrella stood by the door, still damp, a small reminder of his presence. Clara turned back to the crib, checking on Lily, who slept soundly. She lit a lamp, its weak glow pushing back the shadows, and sat by the hearth, staring at the cold ashes. The weight of her loss was still there, heavy and unyielding, but for the first time that day, she didn't feel entirely alone. Not because of promises or grand gestures, but because of a cowboy who'd held an umbrella and hadn't walked away. Outside, the rain tapered off, leaving a quiet that felt both peaceful and ominous. Clara didn't know what tomorrow would bring, more debts, more struggles, more questions she couldn't answer. But as she sat there, listening to the soft creak of the house and Lily's steady breaths, she felt a spark of something she hadn't expected: hope. It was fragile, barely a flicker, but it was there, stubborn as a weed pushing through cracked earth. She didn't know Tom Rourke, didn't know why he'd chosen to stay, but for tonight, it was enough. Tomorrow, she'd face the world again, and maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face it alone.